The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked sidewalk as 8-year-old Sarah clutched her twin baby brothers against her thin frame. Her bare feet, already blistered from the scorching pavement, trembled as she tried to steady herself. Behind her, the front door of what had been her home slammed shut with a finality that echoed through her bones. "Don't come crawling back," her Uncle Robert's voice boomed from behind the locked door. "Thieves don't belong in this house." Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she held 6-month-old Tyler in her left arm and pressed 18-month-old Mason against her chest. Both boys were burning with fever, their small bodies limp and frighteningly warm. The morning had started like any other, with hungry cries that pierced the silence of dawn. But when she had dared to add an extra half-spoonful of formula to their bottles, hoping it might ease their suffering, her Aunt Helen had discovered her crime. The slap across her face still stung, but not as much as the memory of watching precious milk spill across the kitchen floor while her brother screamed in hunger. "Please," Sarah whispered to the closed door, her voice barely audible above the twins' weak whimpering. "They're sick. They need help." The curtains in the front window twitched slightly, and for a moment Sarah glimpsed her aunt's cold eyes peering out. Then the curtains snapped shut, and the house fell silent as a tomb. Across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez was hanging laundry. She glanced over, her face creasing with concern, but when her husband called sharply from inside, she gathered her clothes and hurried indoors. The Johnsons next door were gardening, but they suddenly found urgent work that required them to go inside. One by one, the neighbors who had watched Sarah grow up from a baby turned away, leaving her alone on the burning pavement with 2 dying infants. Sarah had lived with Robert and Helen Thompson since she was 3 years old, after her parents died in what everyone called a tragic car accident. The insurance money had provided well for the 3 children, but over the years, Sarah had noticed how the grocery bags grew smaller, how the heat was turned off more frequently, and how her brother's formula was rationed with increasing strictness. "1 scoop per day," Helen would say, her voice sharp as broken glass. "These babies cost too much as it is." When Sarah tried to explain that the twins were growing and needed more food, Helen would laugh bitterly. "You think money grows on trees? You think I made a milk powder?" But this morning had been different. Tyler's fever had spiked during the night, and Mason had been coughing until he could barely breathe. In desperation, Sarah had taken a risk, just half a scoop extra, praying it would help. She had been so careful, so quiet, but Helen's sharp ears had caught the sound of the measuring spoon scraping against the bottom of the container one too many times. Now, as she sat on the curb with her brothers burning in her arms, Sarah felt the weight of her 5 years as their protector crushing down on her small shoulders. Since the twins were born, she had been their mother in everything but name. She had learned to change diapers by watching YouTube videos on the library computer, had memorized the signs of illness and hunger, had sacrificed her own meals countless times to stretch their meager supplies. The sun climbed higher, and Tyler's breathing became more labored. Mason had stopped crying altogether, which frightened Sarah more than his tears ever had. She tried to stand, thinking she might carry them to the community center 6 blocks away, but her legs, weakened by months of eating scraps, buckled beneath her. "Help us," she whispered to the empty street. "Please, somebody help us." That's when she heard the soft purr of an expensive engine. A sleek black car pulled to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting Sarah's desperate face back at her. For a moment, she thought it might be social services, someone from the county who had finally noticed 3 children living on ration kindness. But when the driver's window rolled down, she saw a face she recognized from the business magazines her late father used to read. Jonathan Hayes was 58 years old, silver-haired, and worth more money than most people could count. He was also a man carrying his own invisible burdens. 25 years earlier, his wife had died giving birth to their twin sons, and he had raised them alone while building his tech empire. The boys, Christopher and Benjamin, were now successful men with families of their own, but Jonathan had never forgotten the fear of being solely responsible for 2 small lives. He had been driving home from the cemetery where he visited his wife's grave every month, his mind heavy with memories, when he saw the small figure hunched on the sidewalk. Something about the way the girl held the babies, with fierce protectiveness despite her own obvious distress, made him break harder than he intended. "What's wrong?" Jonathan asked quietly, stepping out of his car. His voice was gentle but carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Sarah looked up, squinting against the sun that framed his silhouette. "Please, sir," she said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "My brothers are sick. They need milk. I can work for it. I can clean. I could do anything. Please." Jonathan knelt on the hot pavement, ignoring the expensive fabric of his suit. With practiced hands that remembered checking foreheads at 3 in the morning, he felt Tyler's temperature, then Mason's. Both children were dangerously hot. "How long have they been like this?" he asked. "Since yesterday night," Sarah whispered. "I gave them extra formula this morning because they were crying so much, and my aunt, she threw us out. She said I was stealing." Behind them, the Thompson house remained ominously quiet, though Jonathan could sense eyes watching from behind drawn curtains. He had encountered men like Robert Thompson in business, people who saw children as financial burdens rather than precious lives. The thought made his jaw tighten. "What's your name?" he asked Sarah. "Sarah. Sarah Wilson. These are my brothers Tyler and Mason." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Sarah, I'm Jonathan. I'm going to help you, but first we need to get these boys to a hospital. Can you trust me?" Sarah stared into his eyes, kind eyes, tired eyes that reminded her somehow of her father's. She nodded. Jonathan opened the back door of his car and helped Sarah settle the twins in the leather seats. As he buckled them in with expert efficiency, Sarah watched in amazement. This stranger moved like someone who had done this before, who understood the weight of small bodies and the fear that came with their care. "St. Mary's Hospital is 10 minutes away," Jonathan said as he started the engine. "They have an excellent pediatric emergency department." As they drove through the city streets, Sarah held Tyler while Mason lay across her lap. In the rearview mirror, Jonathan watched her gentle movements, the way she adjusted their positions to help them breathe, the way she whispered reassurances they were too fevered to understand. This child had been carrying responsibilities that would crush most adults. At the hospital, Jonathan carried Tyler while Sarah clutched Mason, and together they rushed through the automatic doors. The triage nurse took one look at the feverish babies and immediately called for Dr. Patricia Martinez, the head of pediatric emergency medicine. "Dehydration and respiratory distress," Dr. Martinez announced after a quick examination. "We need 4 fluids immediately, and I want chest x-rays for both of them." As the medical team worked, Sarah stood pressed against the wall, trying to stay out of the way while keeping the twins in sight. She had never been in a hospital before, and the bright lights and urgent voices made her feel dizzy. That's when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They're in good hands now," Jonathan said quietly. "But you look like you haven't eaten in days. When did you last have a meal?" Sarah couldn't remember. Time had become measured not in hours or days, but in feedings given and received, in temperatures taken, in sleepless nights spent listening for dangerous changes in breathing. "I'm not hungry," she lied, the way she had learned to lie to preserve what little food they had. Jonathan studied her thin frame, the way her clothes hung loose, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of chronic exhaustion. "Sarah," he said firmly but kindly, "part of taking care of your brothers means taking care of yourself. You can't pour from an empty cup." He led her to the hospital cafeteria and watched as she devoured a sandwich with the desperate hunger of someone who had been rationing herself for months. While she ate, he made phone calls, first to his assistant, canceling his afternoon meetings, then to his lawyer. "Patricia," he said when Patricia Chun answered, "I need you to research guardianship law, specifically temporary emergency custody in cases of child abandonment." 2 hours later, Dr. Martinez emerged from the treatment room with cautiously optimistic news. "The boys are responding well to treatment," she reported. "Their fevers have broken, and their breathing has improved significantly." "But Sarah," she looked directly at the girl who had been pacing the waiting room like a caged animal. I need to ask you some questions about their care." Sarah's heart stopped. She was sure they were going to accuse her of hurting her brothers, of being an unfit caregiver. But Dr. Martinez's questions were different than she expected. "How did you know to elevate Mason's head when he was having trouble breathing?" I read about it online. At the library. And Tyler's rash on his back. "You've been treating it with something?" "Cornstarch," Sarah whispered. "When we ran out of diaper cream. I read that cornstarch could help." Dr. Martinez exchanged a meaningful glance with Jonathan. "Sarah, these babies have been receiving excellent care. Their growth charts show they've been thriving despite obvious resource limitations. You've been protecting them." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For so long, she had carried the fear that she wasn't enough, that her love and determination couldn't make up for what they lacked. To hear a real doctor, say she had done well felt like a miracle. But the miracle was just beginning. "Sarah," Jonathan said, sitting down beside her in the waiting room, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you feel safe going back to your aunt and uncle's house?" The question hung in the air like a hell breath. Sarah had never been asked this before, had never been given permission to admit her fear. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of years. "They don't want us. They never wanted us." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Then you're not going back." Over the next several hours, as Tyler and Mason recovered in their hospital beds, a different kind of drama unfolded in the corridors of power. Jonathan's lawyer, Patricia Chun, worked with lightning speed to file emergency motions. Hospital social worker Angela Davis interviewed Sarah with gentle thoroughness. Detective Ray Santos, who had been quietly investigating irregularities in the Wilson family insurance claims, suddenly found his case file flagged as urgent. Meanwhile, at the Thompson house, Robert and Helen were discovering that abandoning children in broad daylight had consequences. The first knock on their door came from Child Protective Services. The second came from Detective Santos himself. "We need to talk about the car accident that killed Sarah's parents," Santos said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent untangling lies. Specifically about why the brake lines showed signs of tampering. The web of deception that had hidden behind caring facades began to unravel with devastating speed. Bank records showed systematic theft from the Children's Trust Fund. Medical records revealed a pattern of deliberate neglect. Neighbors, emboldened by official attention, finally spoke up about what they had witnessed but been too frightened to report. As evening fell, Jonathan sat in the hospital room, watching Sarah sleep in the chair between her brothers' beds. Even in exhaustion, she kept one hand on each crib, her body positioned to shield them from any threat. Christopher and Benjamin, his own sons, had arrived hours earlier after frantic phone calls from their father. "Dad," Christopher said quietly, "are you sure about this? Taking on 3 children at your age?" Jonathan looked at his successful, well-educated son, a man who had never known hunger, never slept on a sidewalk, never carried the weight of others' survival on his shoulders. "Christopher," he said slowly, "when your mother died, I thought my world had ended. I was terrified of raising you and Benjamin alone. But you know what I learned? Love multiplies. It doesn't divide." Benjamin, the quieter of the twins, had been watching Sarah sleep. "She's just a kid herself, but look how she's protecting them. She's incredible." "She is," Jonathan agreed. "And she's been carrying this burden alone for too long." The legal proceedings that followed moved with the swift efficiency that money and righteous anger could provide. Within a week, Robert and Helen Thompson were in custody, facing charges of child abuse, neglect, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming: years of stolen money, deliberate malnutrition, and finally, the revelation that Sarah's parents had been murdered for their insurance policies. Jonathan's temporary guardianship became permanent with surprising speed. The judge, a grandmother herself, took one look at the medical reports documenting the children's improved health and Sarah's obvious relief, and made her decision. "Mr. Hayes," she said from her bench, "these children have found their guardian angel. I see no reason to delay what is clearly in their best interest." Moving 3 children into Jonathan's previously quiet penthouse was like introducing chaos into a monastery, beautiful, necessary chaos. Tyler and Mason, recovered from their illness and finally receiving adequate nutrition, began to laugh and play with the boundless energy of healthy babies. Sarah, slowly learning to trust that food would always be available and that her brothers were truly safe, began to remember how to be a child. The first few months weren't easy. Sarah woke every night to check on her brothers, unable to believe they were truly secure. She hoarded food in her pockets until Jonathan gently, but persistently, convinced her that the refrigerator would always be full. She studied every facial expression, every tone of voice, waiting for the moment when this fairy tale would end and they would be thrown out again. But Jonathan was patient in a way that only someone who had loved and lost could be. He understood that trust, once shattered, needed to be rebuilt with consistency and time. Every morning, he proved his commitment. Every evening, he reinforced their safety. Every meal, he demonstrated abundance. Christopher and Benjamin, initially uncertain about their father's impulsive decision, found themselves enchanted by their new siblings. Christopher taught Sarah to play chess, marveling at her quick intelligence. Benjamin, a pediatric nurse himself, took special joy in watching Tyler and Mason reach their developmental milestones with the robust health that good nutrition provided. "They're not broken," Benjamin told his father one evening as they watched Sarah read bedtime stories to the twins. "They were never broken. They were just hungry." The story might have ended there. A perfect rescue, a family made whole, justice served. But the ripple effects of that one moment of compassion continued to spread outward like circles in a pond. Sarah, given access to proper education for the first time in years, proved to be exceptionally gifted. Her teachers, recognizing the unique perspective that hardship had given her, encouraged her to write about her experiences. Her essays about hunger, hope, and the power of kindness began winning contests and scholarships. More importantly, she began advocating for other children in similar situations. Her testimony before the state legislature about the failures in the child protective system led to significant reforms. Her voice, clear and unflinching, carried the authority of someone who had lived the consequences of institutional negligence. Jonathan, meanwhile, discovered that fatherhood the second time around was different than the first. With Christopher and Benjamin, he had been young, ambitious, focused on building his empire while raising his sons. With Sarah, Tyler, and Mason, he was older, wiser, more present. He delegated more at work, traveled less, and found that his greatest joy came not from closing deals, but from Tyler's first steps and Mason's first words. The penthouse that had once echoed with professional silence now rang with laughter, arguments over homework, and the chaos of a family learning to be together. Neighbors who had barely known Jonathan's name now waved to the children in the hallways. The building's doormen kept a supply of lollipops in their pockets. 5 years passed. Sarah grew into a confident teenager, her protective instincts now channeled into student government and volunteer work at children's shelters. Tyler and Mason, healthy and happy, had no memory of their early hunger. They knew only abundance, security, and love. Christopher and Benjamin had children of their own now, and family dinners required a dining room table that seated 12. But the most profound change was in Jonathan himself. The man who had once been described as coldly efficient in business magazines now coached Tyler's Little League team and never missed Mason's school plays. His employees noted that he smiled more, laughed easier, and somehow managed to be more successful while working fewer hours. Love multiplies. He had told Christopher that first night in the hospital. He had been more right than he knew. The final chapter of this story came on a warm spring evening, exactly 6 years after that terrible day on the sidewalk. The family was gathered in their garden for Sarah's 18th birthday party when the doorbell rang. Jonathan opened it to find a young woman about Sarah's age, thin and frightened, holding a baby. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard about you from someone at the shelter. My baby is sick, and I don't have anywhere to go. I know you helped someone once before." Sarah appeared at Jonathan's shoulder, drawn by the desperation in the young woman's voice, a desperation she recognized with crystal clarity. She looked at the baby, flushed with fever, then at the terrified mother who was probably younger than she appeared. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying all the authority of someone who had been there herself. "We need to get them to the hospital." Jonathan smiled and reached for his car keys. "Of course we do." As they drove through the city streets, once again, Sarah holding another sick baby while Jonathan navigated the familiar route to St. Mary's. The circle was complete but not closed. Love had indeed multiplied, creating not an ending but a beginning, a legacy of compassion that would continue to ripple outward, one rescued child at a time. The young mother in the back seat whispered her gratitude, but Sarah shook her head. "Don't thank us," she said softly. "Just promise me that someday, when you're strong enough, you'll help someone else." The promise was made, and Sarah knew it would be kept. After all, she had learned long ago that the smallest act of kindness, something as simple as a spoonful of milk given with love, could change the entire course of a life. Behind them, the city lights blurred past the windows, but ahead lay hope, healing, and the endless possibility of love shared and multiplied. The story that began with abandonment on a hot sidewalk had become something greater, a testament to the truth that in our darkest moments, angels often arrive wearing ordinary faces and carrying car keys. Justice had been served not just in courtrooms and police stations, but in the deeper, more lasting chord of human compassion. The Thompsons spent their years behind bars, but Sarah, Tyler, Mason, and countless others would spend their years in the light. Proof that even in a world that often feels dark, one person's decision to stop, to care, to act can illuminate everything that follows. This story resonates because it reminds us that heroes aren't always wearing capes. Sometimes they're driving cars, making phone calls, or simply choosing to see suffering and respond with love. Each of us has the power to be someone's Jonathan Hayes, to be the person who stops when others drive by, who acts when others look away. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who might need to be reminded that kindness still exists in the world, and that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with the smallest acts of compassion. Your engagement helps us continue telling stories that matter, stories that remind us all of the power we have to change lives, one spoonful of mercy at a time. See you in the next video.